Lloyd Burr Live.
Today.
All right, let's take a look now at what is happening around the rest of the world.
Lloyd Burr Live. World News Today.
Jeffrey Miller is an international analyst with the Democracy Project and joins us now to discuss geopolitical issues and news. Good afternoon, Jeffrey. Let's start with China. The 20th Communist Party Congress is underway. Why is it being held and why is it so significant?
Good evening, Kate. Well, look, this is a routine event, but it's anything but routine. This conference is held every 5 years. It is a party congress, so there's a lot of procedural things that are discussed there, committee appointments and so forth. But China is a one-party state, so these committee appointments really do matter. They tell us a lot about the future direction of China under Xi Jinping. And this conference, though, is also going to appoint Xi Jinping for a record third term. That's what we expect. And that will effectively make him leader for life. It's unprecedented for a leader in China to get that third term. And it's going to put him on a same level, really, as the likes of Mao Zedong. So it is a huge, huge moment. And I think it's something we really need to be watching quite closely. There's a lot to be gained from looking at Xi's speech as well that came out yesterday. It was quite a hawkish speech, talking up the Chinese military, talking about peaceful reunification with Taiwan. But I think the clues perhaps also in that peaceful word there that he does not want a lot of change, and he's promising a lot of continuity and stability by Xi's standards at least.
So there's no fears, I suppose, that Xi Jinping is really going to swoop in right now and try and take back Taiwan?
Not as such. I mean, he's mentioned reunification many times before, so it's not new. I don't think anything in that speech yesterday was totally unexpected. He talked up, as I said, reunification with Taiwan. He talked up the strength of the Chinese military. He warned of dangerous storms ahead. And, it was perhaps a little more hawkish in tone than the last speech 5 years ago. But of course, a lot has changed around the world since then. So we probably expect that. I think perhaps the most interesting thing to come out of that speech was that China is going to continue its zero COVID policy, at least according to what Xi is saying. And at least in the short term, there had been some suggestion or expectation that perhaps they would wind down the zero COVID policy after this Congress. But it looks like it's staying for the next wee while. There's another Congress, the People's Congress in March, and it's possible it will be wound back after that. Remember that China will be heading into the spring then, and it probably makes sense to loosen the restrictions if you're going to do so in the warmer months. But it's wait and see.
And of course, China has a massive influence on the Pacific region. What kind of impact could all of this have on New Zealand?
Well, we've seen this year with Russia's invasion of Ukraine what an impact this has had on New Zealand in terms of inflation, food prices, fuel costs. So, Russia's a minor trading partner in a sense for New Zealand. China's our biggest trading partner by far. A third of our exports go there every year. So if anything happens in China, it affects New Zealand, impacts on us. So I think we should be very interested for that reason.
Let's go to Iran now. What's the latest on that massive prison fire, the Evin prison fire there?
4 people have died at that fire from what we know from what state media is saying. It's very difficult to get information out of Iran, so who knows really what's gone on there. It sounds like the prisoners there, who are mainly political prisoners, by the way, not common criminals, staged some kind of uprising. That's what you deduce from everything that we do know. And this turned into a bit of a firefight there with gunshots and fires being lit. And chanting of death to the dictator outside the prison. But as I say, it's hard to know exactly what's going on in Iran. But what we do know is that after 5 weeks, these protests are only building. They've spread to all 31 provinces of Iran now since the death of that woman, Mahsa Amini, in custody. So they're not showing any signs of slowing down. And this is probably the biggest wave of protests in Iran since at least 2009. And they're calling for regime change. They don't want reform. They really want the downfall of the regime, of the theocracy. So these things just keep going on.
And what has the government there been saying about these protests recently? I'm sure, of course, they don't want them continuing and they will be very angry to see that they are escalating.
Yes, the Iranian government is blaming the West for it, which is really not particularly plausible. This clearly is an internal matter, and this is coming very much from the bottom up, from Iranians who've had enough. I mean, it was over the hijab and the role of the morality police, of course, with arresting that woman, Mahsa Amini. But really, Iranians are very frustrated with their economic situation. They've been under US sanctions really for basically a decade now, and the economy is doing very, very poorly as a result. So very high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, and they've really had enough. So I think there's a lot of frustration from all sectors of society here.
And what has the New Zealand government been saying about these protests? Because I was actually on Jacinda Arderns' Instagram a little earlier, and there is comment after comment after comment, people saying stand up for Iran. And it seems she's been a little quiet, perhaps.
She's being very reticent. She was asked by media in her weekly rounds this morning about this, and she did, say it should be a right to protest. And she pointed to things that New Zealand had done. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade did call in the Iranian ambassador. We do have one in Wellington. They called him in at the end of September to express New Zealand's displeasure and a call for restraint and so forth. But we're not seeing a lot of proactive communication. Nanaia Mahuta, the foreign minister, put out a tweet at the start of October, but Jacinda Ardern, she's being fairly reactive, which is a shame, I think. She does have enormous credibility, Jacinda Ardern, particularly in the Muslim world, because of her response to the Christchurch mosque attacks back in 2019. So she could use her voice and her clout to draw greater attention to what's going on and to call for restraint a bit more vocally, I think, than she's doing. But she doesn't show any appetite of doing so.
And finally to Ukraine, Russian forces are advancing again. What's happening?
Yes, they're advancing on a town called Bakhmut, which is in the Donetsk region, on the road to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. But forget the names because they probably don't mean a lot to most listeners. I think perhaps the real significance of this is Russia trying to regain the narrative in the Donbass. They've been on the run really for the last 6 weeks. Ukraine's made huge gains on the battlefield, and by digging their heels in, at some point, Ukraine was going to meet resistance, and it seems that they've met their resistance here in this town. And Russia is using the Wagner Group here, which is a state-supported but semi-terrorist group to fight the battle here in Bakhmut and try and take it over and wrestle back some of this control that Russia has lost there, both in terms of the narrative and in real terms on the battlefield. So this is Russia quite literally on the warpath, and it might be the beginnings of another Russian fight back, and we might be back to that war of attrition, that grinding war that we saw earlier in the year. And remember, Ukraine is heading into winter, which probably does favour Russia, given that the frozen ground will probably favour the Russian heavy tanks and other armoured vehicles that they've got in greater numbers than the Ukrainians do.
And just quickly, Jeffrey, some figures have come out about Russian casualties in this war. What's the significance of that?
Yeah, this was staggering. The Ukraine claims that Russia has lost 65,000 troops. 65,000 troops have been killed on the Russian side since the start of the war. Now, of course, this is a Ukrainian estimate, so there's probably some embellishment, but even if that was cut in half, it would still be a huge number. If you go back to the 1980s, during the 9 years that the Soviet Union fought in Afghanistan, they lost 15,000. So this is, close to 5 times that number in just 8 months in Ukraine. And that just shows the staggering death toll that this war has taken. When you add Ukrainian battlefield losses and you add civilian casualties, you're probably approaching around 100,000 already by now. It's a staggering death toll, and unfortunately it's probably only going to get worse.
Awful, isn't it? Hey, Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time today. That was Jeffrey Miller, an international analyst with the Democracy Project. It is coming up 6 o'clock. We'll be back after this.